Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're reviewing Jaden McDaniels' season. Of course, he made the all-defensive second team this year and really did earn the first year of that contract extension he signed last year. But there were some areas where Jaden regressed. We'll talk about what he did well this season, where he needs to improve moving forward. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Happy Thursday, everybody. And we're continuing our player review series today by talking about Jaden McDaniels. So we'll get into some Jaden. We'll talk about where he improved this year, where he regressed. Lots of pluses, lots of pros this year for Jaden McDaniels, but also some areas where he did clearly regress or at least did not improve and perhaps stagnated. But given his age, there's so much upside. And of course, the contract the Wolves gave him appears to have been the right move, especially like we'll also talk about how he played in the playoffs. How does that set us up for next year for Jaden McDaniels? What can that tell us if that version of Jaden is the one that's on the floor for Minnesota, the good version from the playoffs? What does that mean for this team moving forward? So we'll get to all that here today. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, we're free and available everywhere and posting daily, Monday through Friday. You can listen to the show wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can also watch on YouTube, and you can follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. A reminder about the Locked On Sports Minnesota app as well. You can download that on Roku or Amazon Fire TV and watch the show there too. All right. So lots to talk about regarding Jaden. And I guess really quickly setting this up, of course, Jaden was the Timberwolves' second first-round pick in the Anthony Edwards draft in 2020. And he just signed a contract extension prior to last season. Well, actually not prior. It was like right after the season started. And so his salary next year jumps from $3.9 million on the books this year to over $22.5 million next year. It was a 5-year deal. And, you know, he's going to average like basically 26.5 or so million over the course of the deal. And it was a deal that had to get done based on how important Jaden was to everything the Wolves were doing and how good he was defensively. I would say last year, mostly, I think he was maybe even a little bit overrated what his impact was the first 2 years in the league, but the seeds were there. It was obvious that with Jaden's physical tools and how hard he plays defensively, it was clear that he could be a top defender in this league. And he was. He got defensive player of the, or excuse me, all defensive team votes in 22-23. And this year he did end up making the all defensive second team. And had a shot at making the first team, really. He ended up, let's see. I was going to see where he ended up. He didn't get any defensive player of the year votes, but he was a pretty big shoe-in. Let's see. Actually, he was fourth on the second team in terms of points won, but he was pretty easily ahead of fifth, and it wasn't really in any danger of falling out of the second team. So he was second all defensive team pretty solidly this year. And of course, there is defensive player of the year upside there with Jaden McDaniels. It's rare that a perimeter player wins it. It's just you're on an island. That's a different conversation, but it's hard to win defensive player of the year as a guard or as a wing. But Jaden's somebody who's got a shot at doing it because of his physical tools. He actually, could have decent block shot numbers. They weren't the total number of block shots wasn't all that impressive this year, but that's a number that could improve as he gets older and just gets better and savvier. So anyway, from an award side, he certainly did get some accolades nationally this year, but the Wolves knew going into this season, Tim Conley knew he had to get that extension done. And it's a good thing that he did. Jaden turns 24 at the end of September. So before the start of next year, that's when his contract kicks in. So his contract will go through his age 28 season, and he'll be solidly in his prime when he's up for another contract extension. All right. So the big thing from 22-23 that stuck out for Jaden McDaniels leading into the contract year was the offense. And the defense was more consistent, to be clear. I said this already. I thought it was much better in his third year than it was in his first 2 years. But offensively, he shot almost 40% for three in the 22-23 season. He was 39.8% after before that, shooting basically average. He had a weird, like 36% as a rookie, under 32% as a second-year player, and then 40% as a third-year player. So he was all over the map. This year, he somehow found a number in between there and laid it there. So his three-point percentage, like if you were looking at a line chart, if you're watching me on YouTube, I'm going to do a line chart with my hand, a line graph. He went from basically league average 36% as a rookie down to 31.7%, way up to 39.8%, so 40%, and then back down to 33.7%, which is solidly between his first 2 years from outside the arc. And the volume has remained remarkably consistent. His actual three-point rate has remained remarkably consistent. This was actually his lowest. Well, actually, no, last year was his lowest three-point rate. I don't know. Like, there's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason to Jaden's three-point shooting. He's certainly a little bit streaky. We saw that in the playoffs. But the process, I don't think, was all that bad. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. But the raw numbers, the field goal percentage took a slight dip. The three-point percentage took a pretty significant hit. And he got to the line a lot less frequently. We'll talk about shot selection here in a minute. So if you're just looking at his per-game numbers, and that's not how one should just evaluate a player, but it's how a lot of fans just kind of glance at it and be like, what's this guy average? He went down from averaging basically 12, 4, and 2, 12, 4, 2, and 1 in terms of blocks. So 12 points, 4 rebounds, 2 assists, and a block per game last season to 10.5, 3, 1.5, and a half block a game. So all the per game stuff went down. In fact, he actually played slightly less minutes per game. Now, why was that? Well, technically, like, he actually averaged less fouls per game this year. His foul rate was lower this year than the year before. It was just now remember early in the season, he had a calf issue that cropped up. I think in the preseason, he missed a couple games early, and then it came back a little bit later in the year. And so he missed, he did miss the first 2 games of the regular season. He played until basically like the week before Thanksgiving, and then ended up missing like 8 games because of the calf issue. And the Timberwolves actually only lost 1 game during that stretch. They went, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They went 7-1 during the stretch when Jaden was out with the calf injury, not included the first 2 games of the season. So the minutes per game was dragged down a little by some of that early season stuff. He had a 2-minute game in there and a 4-minute game. Oh, the 2-minute game was when he got ejected against Golden State in the Rudy Draymond game. Then a 4-minute game against the Knicks where he re-injured his calf. And then the rest of the year, those minutes per game were where they had been the year prior. In terms of production, again, I don't think the process was all that bad. However, some of the shot selection, when it came down to it, when we get in the weeds on it, was a bit dicier than it was the year prior. And then obviously the execution just wasn't as good. So I want to get into his process next. We will talk about like where he was getting his shots, what the overall impact was of his offense. We'll talk a little bit about some of the B-ball index metrics, and the on-off too, I think, is pretty interesting when it comes to Jaden. So we'll get to all of that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Game Time. Game Time makes getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. You can get last-minute deals on Game Time. You can save up to 60% off buying last minute for anything that includes sports, including the finals, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. I am always a last-minute buyer, and I do love to attend all of the above. We're considering going to a theater show here soon. We like comedy shows, concerts, depending on who's in town. Game Time is the best place to get tickets for all of the above. You can also save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event with flash deals, and on zone deals. You can save more by choosing a section and letting Game Time choose the seats. Get a panoramic view from your seat as well in the app before you buy. And the lowest price guarantee of Game Time will allow Game Time to credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying your tickets, including to the NBA Finals, if you find yourself in Dallas over the next few days, or perhaps in Boston later this week, if Dallas can indeed extend the series. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code Locked On NBA. That's LOCKEDON NBA for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Do you watch Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long? If so, no doubt you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting. Instead, make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, so Jaden McDaniels this year. The most concerning thing to me for Jaden McDaniels this is actually for his career. It's not the 3-point percentage I already talked about was all over the map. And we'll talk shot selection. But to me, the thing that bothers me the most about Jaden to this point in his career is the lack of production on the glass, the lack of rebounding chops for Jaden McDaniels. In fact, his rebound rate has only gone down. His defensive rebound rate has literally regressed every single year he's been in the league, from his rookie year to this last season. His total rebound rate trend line is nearly the same. And this is also a career low offensive rebound rate year. So career lows across the board in offensive rebounding, defensive rebounding, and total rebound rate. That's a problem for a dude that's 6'9" and possibly actually bigger with a massive wingspan and crazy athleticism. I know that the biggest reason for this is the amount of energy he expends on the perimeter and the amount of time he spends on the perimeter guarding scorers. Not necessarily point of it. I mean, he does guard point of attack, obviously, and that's his second most. In fact, on B-Ball Index, it has his he spends roughly a third of his time guarding shot creators and 18% of his time guarding primary ball handlers, which seemed a little low to me. But either way, he was 98th percentile for guarding shot creators or just scorers, wing scorers a lot of the time, or primary ball handlers was 81st percentile. So he's guarding the guys with the ball in their hands, which are usually on the perimeter. That means, just factually, he's further away from the rim more often, which means there's less opportunities for rebounds. However, I still think there's room for activity level from Jaden, especially in some of those in-between rebounds. We talked about this at a couple points in the playoffs. Against Denver, actually, was a big one. And then also early in the Dallas series, we talked about this. The Timberwolves were leaving rebounds on the floor in the playoffs because they weren't getting those in-between rebounds. And some of that is luck, but when it comes to loose balls, 50-50 balls, and rebounding in general, you kind of make your own luck. It's anticipation, it's it's positioning. Not everybody's going to be Kevin Love and like talk about how they can analyze where the shot comes off the rim and where you go to rebound it. Like if you're guarding somebody on the perimeter and you're going 100 miles an hour doing that, you don't have time to do all the other stuff, but you do have time to turn around and at least put some additional effort into grabbing a loose ball, trying to have some anticipation. Don't get caught in no man's land. And I'm nitpicking a little on Jaden. I'm not trying to sound like he doesn't play hard. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying that there's a rebound or two per game, probably more like a rebound a game, that Jaden McDaniels is leaving on the table that would really help him and his team if he improved his rebound rate. Now, in the playoffs, the Timberwolves had a clear strategy against Phoenix to have Jaden execute corner crashes against the Suns, who are a big team, but not a great rebounding team because a lot of their size is Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, Bradley Beal, but they didn't have frontline size. It was just Yusuf Nurkic and nobody else that Phoenix wanted to play. So we saw Jaden get at least 2 offensive rebounds in all 4 games of that series. He had 12 offensive rebounds over the course of 4 games. That's 3 offensive boards a game, which is massive. In that game 2 win, he had 5 offensive rebounds and scored 25 points. And you better believe 5 of those offensive rebounds, at least 3 or 4 of them led to dunks or, layups that he got, which helped him get to those 25 points, which, by the way, 25 points is just one off his career high. 25 points. And in that game, he only made 2 threes. He was 10 of 17 on twos. And a lot of it was the activity on the offensive glass. We saw that improve in the playoffs. Now, in 5 games against Dallas, he only had 3 offensive rebounds. And Denver, he was somewhere in the middle. He actually was pretty good against Denver. He had 0 in 2 games and then 2 or more in every other game against Denver. Against Dallas, he had 3 offensive rebounds across 5 games, and he had 1 offensive rebound over the final 4 games. 1 rebound total on the offensive end over the final 4 games of the series against the Mavs. I'm sure fatigue plays into it. And this is a thing that keeps coming up, and we have to acknowledge it. And now Dallas certainly looks tired against Boston in the finals, right? It certainly plays into it, and that's a factor. The Wolves had to really go all out to beat Denver and get to the conference finals. But if we're just talking regular season as well, again, Jaden had a career low in offensive rebound rate. You look at his game log during the regular season, and he very rarely was getting more than 1 offensive rebound in a game. He had, it looks like 5 games where he had 3 offensive rebounds, but he was more often getting 0 offensive rebounds than he was getting 2. He had far more instances of 0 offensive rebounds than 2 in a game. Jaden's leaving possessions on the table and points on the table, frankly, on the offensive end by not crashing the glass. Those corner crashes are almost always open. It's not something that a lot of teams focus. It's a tough thing to defend. And it's just NBA players are not consistent at boxing out. They're just not. And especially when you're crashing from a weird place like the corner. And Jaden's big enough, long enough, and fast enough to recover defensively. Because one of the dangers from that is then you could be behind the 8 ball. If the rebound caroms the other way, if it goes out towards the center of the floor, then you're way behind the play. And that's certainly a danger, especially for a team that's had their issues in transition defense. But Jaden is, again, long enough and fast enough and good enough at rear contests. He can recover, get back, even get to the ball or cover somebody on the other end in time to at least impact the play going the other way. And I think the risk could be worth the reward depending on the matchup. So I think more frequent corner crashes, because he's often in the corner offensively without the ball in his hands, but more frequent activity on the offensive end of the floor will lead to extra possessions for the Wolves offense and more points and more efficient scoring for Jaden McDaniels. The overall, defensive rebounding, it was also a career low for him. Just 8.7% of available defensive rebounds were grabbed by Jaden McDaniels. That's down more than a point from last year, and he's down 4.5 points from his second year in the league and nearly 5 points from his rookie year in the league. Defensive rebound rate. Again, he's playing more at the 3 than he was early in his career. He's mostly playing the 4 next to Karl-Anthony Towns in his rookie and second year in the league. So that's going to come down a little. I'm not suggesting he needs to average, I don't think that rebound rate is realistically going to be near 14% again. I'm not saying he's got to average 5 boards a game, 6 boards a game. But if he was just solidly, 5 boards a game is within the realm. 6 is aggressive for somebody who's going to be on the perimeter as much as he is. But if he could be in the 4 rebound a game range, which again is just 1 more per game, that matters over the course of the season. And if that extra board is on offense, then that just improves his overall floor as a player. But even defensively, like he should be more active on the defensive glass. And that to me is it's a little bit of a gripe for me with Jaden McDaniels. I want to talk, we'll save shot selection for last. We'll get to that here in a second, but there's a handful of other numbers where he just regressed. Like the assist rate was down from last year. He had the ball in his hands maybe a little bit less this season with a full year I guess really it has more to do with Anthony Edwards, but also Karl-Anthony Towns being healthy, but Anthony Edwards just asserting himself more. And the block rate was down. It was actually a career low block rate for Jaden McDaniels this year. I mentioned that off the top that like a few more blocks would help his case eventually someday for a Defensive Player of the Year award. That's something he was really good at last year in 22-23 was chase down blocks in transition, rear contests on guys who he would actually let get a half step because he knew he could block their shot from behind. He didn't spend a lot of time as the low man this year just because of Rudy Gobert's presence, but he gives you some reasonable rim protection if Rudy's in pick and roll action. If he ends up down there, say he's guarding somebody in the corner, that's often not the case because he's usually guarding point of attack or a secondary score for the other team. He's very rarely guarding a lower usage corner shooter type guy. But if he is, he can help off of them and protect the rim. So that's one of the things the Wolves played around with in the playoffs very infrequently. But the idea was if Rudy's going to be pulled away from the rim, let's stick Jaden on somebody else because we have Nikhil and we have Anthony Edwards. And if they can guard the point of attack, then Jaden can play the Rudy role, the typical Rudy role, which is, and he's going to be better at contesting, getting out to contest a corner 3 or recovering to the paint than Rudy is. So that's something else I think the Wolves can play around with, and it actually could save some mileage for Jaden. We'll talk here in a second about some of the B-ball index numbers, and he ran a ton this year. He chases guys all over the floor. He plays hard. But against certain opponents, could you save some mileage by sticking him really in the dunker spot defensively, where he's essentially the low man, he's guarding the rim, but he's also recovering to contest corner 3-point attempts against his primary, the person he's guarding, his primary cover. So that could improve the block rate. It could also, save some mileage on Jaden himself over the course of a season. Just something to think about. I think they could play around with it depending on matchups in the regular season. All right, I want to talk about his offense next. A couple B-ball index numbers. I want to talk about shot selection overall and what that resulted in terms of his efficiency and a bit of a dip in efficiency this year. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is sponsored by our friends at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 5 million members. It's the most fun and exciting way to get in on the action where you watch your favorite sports and players. You just pick more or less on 2 or more player stats for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. With Prize Picks, you could turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game. Watching your favorite sports this summer, you can make a Prize Picks lineup in as little as 60 seconds. You just need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you're locked in. If you're looking for promotions, they have you covered every week, from lowering select player stat projections on Tuesdays, which increases your chance of getting a win, to getting your entry fees back if you have a losing lineup on Fridays. Prize Picks, again, America's #1 fantasy sports app, over 5 million members. Also, this is the perfect time to try out something new. Basketball is winding down here, likely in the next week. Make sure to try out esports this month. Every Wednesday and Saturday in June, if your lineup doesn't win, you'll get your entry fee back. Choose from Counter-Strike 2, Call of Duty, League of Legends, and more. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the app, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. All right, so Jaden's offense. We talked already about the dip in 3-point percentage. The process for him, I didn't think looked drastically worse. The biggest difference this season for me was some of those attempts that Jaden was getting at the rim, trying to throw down on guys, trying to lay them up. Those turned into his little float, kind of the float to the side, floating jump shot that he likes to shoot. And that was a poor way of describing it, but you know what I'm talking about if you watched enough Wolves games this year. A few too many of his possessions turned into that, and he was okay at it, but it just hurt his overall efficiency. So his 3-point rate this season was actually up slightly from the year prior, but his rim attempts were down nearly 7 points per game. Sorry, not 7 points per game. I said that terribly. 7 percentage points. So last year, 22-23, about 29% of his shot attempts came at the rim. This year, only 22% did. And he shot more shots from the 3 to 10 foot range, more shots from the 10 to 16 foot range. Thankfully, the 16 foot to 3-point line has stayed consistently low since it was too high as a rookie. Remember, as a rookie, he was either threes or he would pump fake and dribble to a bad contested 2. Second year, it was kind of the same thing. He just got a little bit deeper before he shot the contested 2. Third year, he was getting to the rim more often. Now, this year, he regressed. This was actually his career low in terms of field goal, the percentage of his field goal attempts coming at the rim, a career low. However, he was more efficient than ever before at the rim. He was 78% at the rim. He was also about 50% from that 3 to 10 foot range. So that weird floating to the side jumper he shot it at 50%. That's pretty good. Like, that's better than a lot of guys are going to shoot in that range on the floor. However, if he just shoots an extra 3 per game at league average percentage, that's still a better play than shooting 50% on a contested 6-footer. So shot selection wise, and also, by the way, it's not a zero-sum game here. He also could be getting a little bit deeper and attempting those shots at the rim. We're essentially looking at, a shot every couple of games less at the rim, because then the snowball there is he also gets to the line less often. This was also his lowest free throw rate that he's had since his rookie year. And he's a 73% free throw shooter. That was in line with where he's been for his career. But the man played in 72 games this year, and he only attempted 79 free throws. It was the lowest free throw rate since his rookie season. That's never going to likely be a huge part of his game. But, I mean, just last season, 22-23, he was getting nearly 2 free throw attempts per game. He's 1.8 per game. And this year is 1.1 point per game. So you layer in the reduction of offensive rebounds for Jaden McDaniels, or really they were never there, but there was a reduction this year. He got less offensive rebounds. He got to the line nearly 1 time per game less and made a half free throw less per game. And then we could also talk about the 3-point shooting, the percentage being down 6 points. But that's why he averaged nearly 2 points less per game this season. That's the formula to reducing your points per game and your overall offensive impact. And it's not simply about the raw scoring. It's about the process and then ultimately the execution. So the process was close. He's just got to get to the rim a little more, let those threes fly a little bit more, and then obviously he's got to make his 3-point shots. And we saw in the playoffs, there were moments where he was great. I mean, like he was 43% from outside the arc in the playoffs. He certainly got hot a couple of times, but that's part of it, right? I mean, that's going to happen over the course of a season. He had early in the playoffs, he actually didn't do much outside the arc. That 25-point game, I said this earlier, there were only 2 made 3-pointers in that game for Jaden against Phoenix. He made 3 3-pointers in the Phoenix series. In the Denver series, he didn't make a 3-pointer until game 4, and then he made 6 combined in game 6 and 7 when he exploded for those 20-plus point games. And then he ended up with 3 consecutive 20-plus point games, the final 2 games against Denver, and then the game 1 loss to Dallas. And then he came alive a little bit late in the Dallas series and made some 3-pointers because he was being left open as the Mavs were loading up on Ant. But that's really all he did, was he shot those threes and did nothing else. He became a stationary shooter. So some of that aggressiveness we saw earlier in the season turned into just being a stationary shooter. And we know there's more there for Jaden. It's such an interesting needle to thread because McDaniels has all of the tools, and he's clearly improved in terms of his offensive touch. His handle's gotten better. And they're not asking him to literally be Scottie Pippen. I know that those comparisons have been out there now for a couple of years, and they're certainly like the skill set, the tools are there for him to be an all-star caliber player. The offense just isn't consistent enough or smooth enough. And it goes back to shot selection. He needs to be able to let it fly with a quick release from outside the arc. He needs to be confident. I know he had that like there was that one stretch this year where the 3-point shot was so bad for Jaden. I'm going to see if I can find it real quick in his game log. It must have been right at the end of the regular season, where the 3-point shooting was just really, really rocky. And he completely lost his confidence outside the arc for a period of time. But we also saw just last year, he was a 40% 3-point shooter. So if he can maintain his confidence there, and also, by the way, as a corner 3-point shooter, like that's the other thing, is if he could just maintain a high percent of his shots coming from the corners, he'd be much better off there. He's 38%. That's actually a little bit low for his career from the corners, but he's obviously more comfortable shooting there. It's an easier shot. And the Wolves offense should generate corner attempts for him. So it's letting it fly from 3, less of the in-between stuff, more getting all the way to the rim, and just quicker decisions. And it's something I think he has improved on incrementally. But this year, it turned itself into some of these tough floater, 6-foot jumpers where he's floating to the side. And then also the other thing is the offensive rebounding we talked about earlier. Like there's points to be had there on the offensive glass for Jaden McDaniels. And he just needs to pick up an extra board every couple of games, and he could find himself scoring more points. Like that's a real thing that could impact the Wolves offense in a positive way, that he's leaving points on the table there. So in summary, I mean, this was a good year for Jaden McDaniels. He made the second team all defense, and he added something to his offensive game. But there's a lot of room for improvement as he goes into his age 24 season. He should shoot it better from outside the arc. I mean, he was below his career average this year, even though it's been topsy-turvy over the last 4 years in terms of his 3-point percentage. That number, like that, will come up. He'll shoot better than 33.7% this year from outside the arc. I'm confident of that this coming season. I didn't spend as much time on his defense because we know what that is. The B-ball index numbers I was going to mention, defensive miles per 75 possessions. We talked about this with Nickeil Alexander-Walker, 98th percentile for Jaden McDaniels. The dude travels. We talked earlier about who he guards, shot creators, primary ball handlers, is about half of his possessions. That's who he's guarding. The next most would be stationary shooters 12% of the time, which is what I referenced earlier. Like, they could put him on a corner shooter and then tell him, hey, protect the rim, do the Rudy thing. That's a way you can save some legs for him depending on the opponent. If it's an opponent that maybe runs a lot of pick and roll but doesn't have another scorer, like a high usage wing that's going to score, put Jaden in that role. Save some mileage there, see if he can get some block shots, kind of change things up for him a little bit. Some of the other defensive metrics weren't worse than last year, like steals. We saw the steal rate kind of stagnate a little bit. Deflections is still active, not maybe to the level he was the year prior. Ball screen navigation is still awesome. Like, all that stuff is really good on the defensive end. There's no question. I think there were times middle of the season where he got a little worn down, maybe coming off the calf injury, depending on if it wasn't a top matchup that he was really getting up for. I think he occasionally had moments where he struggled and that dragged down some of the metrics, but we know if the challenge presents itself, Jaden McDaniels can lock anybody up in this league. So really strong year, again, defensively for Jaden McDaniels. The challenge for Jaden is to not stagnate overall. It's to get that three-point shot to come back up, increase the activity on the glass, and add another element to his game next year. Turn himself from a defensive player of the year candidate, an all-defensive team, second teamer, to a first teamer, and maybe an all-star in the next couple of years if he could just improve that offensive consistency, really, more than anything else. That's, if I could pick one word, it's consistency for Jaden McDaniels. I know that Chris Fitch has called him a barometer, a bellwether for the Wolves offense. That's a lot to put on Jaden McDaniels, especially given his lack of consistency. But I certainly think there's truth to, if he plays well consistently, that gives the Wolves a legit, call it fourth option in their offense, or even third option in their offense. He could turn into that third option if he becomes a little bit more consistent defensively. And again, the idea of moving him off of point of attack, because you have a Nikhil, you have an Ant, eventually a Jalen Clark, et cetera, that can guard on the perimeter. That's another way that they can maybe save some juice for offense for Jaden. All right. Tomorrow, Friday's show, I think we'll do Rudy Gobert on Friday. We'll do Cap Monday and Ant Tuesday, unless there's any other news we need to get to. And then we'll be a week away from the draft. Remember, the first round this year, I forgot this the other day when I mentioned it. First round's on a Wednesday. It's 2 weeks from yesterday. So we'll spend a week looking at the draft, the end of the first round, and then the top of the second round where the Wolves are scheduled to pick. So we'll get to that after the player reviews. Tomorrow we'll do Rudy. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves, and of course at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.